is Mr. Ayodele Adio, the local government chairmanship candidate of the Youth Party in Lagos, the just concluded elections. And we also have joining us the executive director of Yaga Africa, Mr. Samson Itodo, who joins us from our Abuja studio. Let's get this started, gentlemen. Thank you, by the way, for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to start with you, Mr. Itodo, for good reason. We've began earlier on by reflecting on the legacies of Mr. President, and some of the high points that came through was Mr. President, of course, giving us the legacy of some very critical legislations like the PIB governance law, and of course the not too young to run bill. And you are a very prominent actor at that time that also midwifed that process as far as the not too young legislation is concerned. But of course, there are very many sides to Mr. President that people have been talking about. What is most profound for you, Mr. Itodo, that will be your takeaways from your close relations with late Muhammadu Buhari during his tenure as president?
Well, thank you very much. Let me really start by paying respect to the late president and to condole, with his family. And we stand with them in this moment of grief. The nation is grieving, and we pray that his soul, receives eternal rest. President Buhari was one who had a contested legacy, but one thing you won't take from the former president is his level of discipline. I have interacted, at close range with him on several occasions with the not too young to run legislation. You also saw that he signed into law the most consequential electoral legal framework, which is the 2022 Electoral Act, after declining assent about 5 times. And that act is perhaps the best election legal framework that we have since our sort of advent into democracy. So you give it to him. When you look at issues around infrastructure, he was quite, vocal. And his actions also demonstrated, commitment, to ensuring that infrastructural development was recorded during his tenure. I think that when you look at his leadership style, he has a very interesting and perhaps controversial leadership style. I think on one hand, you give it to the president. He was quite disciplined. In his administration, aside the not too young to run bill and also the Electoral Act, I did serve on the committee that was responsible, for developing Nigeria's Agenda 2060. As well as the Nigeria's development plan under the leadership of Atedo Peterside. And I tell you, on every occasion that we went to the villa to meet with the president was very prompt and early to meetings. And they know if the meeting is 8 o'clock, the president will be there, some minutes to 8. And so he was that leader that espoused those values. And so we've, yes, to a large extent lost, a leader. But there are also other sides, perhaps also tied to his leadership. And I think there are grave lessons that people need to learn, and even our leaders. First, his administration was regarded as one of missed opportunities on different fronts. That yes, whilst we had an improved electoral legal framework, but there was a weak democratic culture, in those 8 years. You would also look at, at sort of democratic credentials, the political intolerance. There were issues around the NSAS. We cannot ignore that fact and how young people were treated. You could also see how there were several disappearances of media personnel, and all that, actually contest some of the legacies that he's left behind. But on the whole, he was a leader, and I think he's one leader that needs to be studied, especially his own leadership philosophy and style. I don't know if giving your lieutenants, your appointees free will without any form of oversight, I don't think it's a best leadership style. I think leadership is about responsibility, and when you appoint people into office, you've got to provide oversight. And we have seen, post his administration, how there have been several corruption cases, and how some of his ministers, took advantage of his lack of oversight on their leadership to actually plunder the resources of the state and mismanaged and abused power, which was vested into them in trust.
And studying is critical. The question is, how much value will this generation place on studying? Because it's important to also learn, the mistakes of the past. Speaking of which, let me bring that to Mr. Adio, who represents the Youth Party. And we didn't miss out on some of the reactions of young people when you consider the younger voting bloc, or the younger people who dominate the political space, particularly on the social networking site, X, which was formerly Twitter. We didn't miss out on those vengeful reactions, but we've since been led to understand that their perception of the former president is incomplete. From where you stand, Mr. Adio, what does it look like? Are there, concerns and reactions? Are they valid, giving their own experience of the other side of former President, late Muhammadu Buhari?
Well, first, let me pay my respect to the former president and my condolences to his family, loved ones, and friends. May his soul rest in perfect peace. Now, to your question about whether young people validly feel hurt, about the leadership style of the former president, to a very large extent, I listened to Mr. Sampson, who touched on, a very important part of his legacy, passing the not too young to run bill, as it were. I think it was also President Muhammad Buhari who passed the Startup Act, which was one of the most defining legal framework or legislation for the tech ecosystem and tech community in Nigeria, which was quite a consequential bill to sort of move forward that particular ecosystem. But having said that, it will be very difficult to discountenance the hurt that young people felt towards the former president, given the reality and their experience, during the NSAS protests. They saw, how their friends were indiscriminately dehumanized by the military that, were under his command. And not just that, beyond that, they saw how they were placed on no-fly lists. They were trailed by the DSS for several months. Their bank accounts, were shut down. Many of them had to flee the country. So that, you would argue, was not a palatable experience for many young people. You would also recall that at the time, Twitter, as it was shut down for several months, and people had to use VPNs to be able to interact on the platform or connect to the global community. So to that extent, it's easy to see why it left a sour taste in the mouths of many young people. But even more importantly, you would argue that the economy did not work for young people during his 8 years in office, because our economy faltered. Cost of living went up. The purchasing power index started to collapse under his watch. Unemployment and poverty worsened. Per capita income plunged under his watch. And so young people did not experience the kind of boom that perhaps your generation experienced between 2003 and 2015. So young people who were leaving the university came into a more difficult job market. They came into an environment where it was consumption was a lot more difficult than it was in the previous decade. So to that extent, you could also say that that was a missed opportunity for the president. And also, you would also argue that while he came into office when insecurity was on the rise, especially with the northeastern part of the country, you would argue that the rise of banditry, the rise of, the mercenaries that were coming in from the Sahel worsened under his watch, and insecurity spread, to places like the northwestern part of the country and killed hundreds, if not thousands of people, and plunged many into IDP camps. So on that particular scorecard, because you recall it became more difficult for young people to travel around the country because kidnappings were on the rise, insecurity was on the rise, the economy wasn't working for them. So that really was the picture that many young people saw of this president. Of course, it is true that, there are always two sides to every person, and there's always two sides to even to the former president Buhari, who was a staunch disciplinarian. He was one leader that said, I knew his house in Kaduna many years ago. I used to drive past, or rather, my parents would drive me past his house on my way to my grandmother's house, who was staying in Kaduna at the time. So he was really a frugal leader. He wasn't one that lived an ostentatious lifestyle. What you see was what you got. His leadership side, like Samson said, he delegated a lot, which means he bestowed trust on the people that he appointed. But that also had its consequences, because people used his name to do all sorts of things, and which didn't turn out well for the country. So there are many sides to the former president. It depends on the vantage point with which you're looking at it from. For those who were close to him, talked about his warmth. They talked about his honesty, his dignity, his integrity, his love for the country. He was a soldier, and there's no doubt about that. But for young people, the economy didn't work for them. For those who were passionate about the rule of law, you would recall that it was under his watch that judges were abducted in the middle of the night, harassed. It was under his watch that the CGN was unceremoniously removed, from office. And things like that. So it's a mixed bag, if you asked me, and it depends on where you're looking at it from. But there's no doubt that he was a patriot. He served his country as a soldier, as a military head of state. But, to journalists, if you recall his time in 1984, the decree that he passed that threw several journalists into jail, his attack on the media at the time. So, it just depends on where you're looking at it from.
All right. Let me take you to Samson. Mr. Samson, as we said, it's a mixed bag, depending on who and what you're looking at. And we will always remember Muhammadu Buhari differently. But I want to look at it from the point of lessons of legacy as far as leadership is concerned, what current leadership can learn. Now, as they say in that movie, Game of Thrones, his watch is ended. His time has gone. What we can rely on now is whatever experiences we had personally and positionally with him as Muhammadu Buhari, either as head of state or, for those in the military, where he commanded, and as president and commander-in-chief of the armed forces as civilian leader. Yeah. For this generation who do not care whose ox is God, they will speak their mind no matter what it is. 50 years from now, a lot of the persons who are alive in their 50s, 60s may not be here. And for the younger generations, people that are born in 2000 and maybe slightly before that, their greatest memory will be about that NSAS. So they will be the witnesses of today as far as the legacy of Muhammadu Buhari is concerned. What do you think they will be communicating that time that it should be a lesson to the current leadership right now to be careful about legacy?
As a Christian, there's a hymn that talks about only remembered by what we have done. And we need, and current leaders need to understand that you will only be remembered by what you have done. And the question is, are you going to be remembered for the good things that you did or for the bad things that you did? And I think there are three things that perhaps will be communicated. The first one is one of responsibility. That leadership is about responsibility, and it's taking responsibility for actions that you take. You cannot be a leader and not take full responsibility for the decisions and the choices that you make. And it's important. And when you're when you're in public governance and public leadership, there's a reason why you have people who you ought to appoint, who you appoint to deliver on certain responsibilities. You have to oversight those individuals because there's need for checks and balances in public governance. So you need to provide that oversight. It is right under our nose. I don't know what we're going to tell our kids. That once upon a time, the governor of the central bank plundered, stole Nigeria's money to the extent that only one individual had over 750-something houses in an estate under an administration where the president was celebrated as an anti-corruption icon. How do you juxtapose that? How do you juxtapose that with the corruption about Nigeria's air? How Nigerians were deceived. And then you say that you had a president who was actually celebrated as Baba Megaskia, as one who didn't tolerate corruption. How do you juxtapose that? And so the point about oversight is important. You can't appoint people to work with you and not oversight them. So that's lesson number one. The second lesson that really we need to learn is the one of discipline. And I think this is actually on a very positive note. And you cannot challenge the fact that the late president was very disciplined in the way he managed his affairs. And like my brother said, yes, he was very frugal. And you know, he talks about the number of houses that he has, whether he was going to leave any form of inheritance for his children. He was very frugal. And for him, he was very determined to ensure that, you know, his legacy of integrity was not tainted. Now, that can be contested in view of some of the things that have come after, you know, his time in office. But he was one that was very disciplined about time. He was very disciplined about the commitments that he made. He was also loyal, you know, to his former friends and people who stood by him. I think the other lesson that needs to learn is Nigeria is a diverse country. It's a diverse country that is created as a result of regional and ethnic pacts. You cannot be a president and not ensure that every component of this country is represented. Whether or not people vote for you, you must be fair in distributing, you know, the promise of democracy to people. And you see that, you know, when we say it's a missed opportunity, yes, we were quite a divided nation, but there were some sections of the country that really felt marginalized. And the body language and the remark from the late president didn't provide succor, didn't give people a sense of belonging. And we thought that, you know, it would be an opportunity to lead national reconciliation. Unfortunately, it failed. You cannot have leaders who are not nationalistic in the appointments that they make, in the way they manage state affairs. And that's something I think that we need to learn. And also that now we're talking about his legacies, whether negative or positive. For those who are in office today, they need to know that they're only going to be remembered by the things that they have done. If you sow, you know, bad leadership and bad precedent, you're going to reap it. And your children, you know, will live to hear Nigerians talk about some of the bad decisions and the bad precedent that leaders set while in office.
Thank you, Mr. Etodo. Tributes have been pouring in, as we've said time and again. Yes, the federal government delegation is in London now to accompany his body back to the country. But his colleague, his head of state colleague and president colleague, Olusegun Obasanjo, has also been speaking about late President Muhammadu Buhari. So let's take a listen to former President Olusegun Obasanjo, and we'll come back for more on this, gentleman.
He tried his best. my prayer is that God will forgive him of his inadequacies and accept him into his kingdom. It's a loss to the nation, because at a time like this, we need the totality of the experience and what I may call statesmanship of all those who have had opportunity to run the affairs of this country in the past to get us out of the situation we are in. He will be sorely missed, and may his soul rest in perfect peace.
Well, there you have former President Olusegun Obasanjo. And let's just add this news just in that a plenary session has been rescheduled by the National Assembly till Tuesday, July the 22nd, in honor, according to a statement by the clerk to the National Assembly, in honor of the legacy and service to the nation of former President Muhammadu Buhari. So the National Assembly is mourning the passing of the former president who died yesterday, and by extension has rescheduled plenary. So all of the National Assembly's plenary legislative activities are hereby suspended until Tuesday, July the 22nd, 2025. So all members of the National Assembly are urged to reschedule their engagement to enable full participation in the burial activities of the late president. So that's new just in from the National Assembly. Mr. Adio, let me come to you quickly now. I know this conversation is also meant to be about the local government elections in Lagos State, the outcome. So maybe we could touch on the politics of it now. So he is someone who's seen as a major rallying point for politics in Nigeria. I'm not sure anybody has had the kind of votes he's had time and again consistently in Nigeria. So for a lot of politicians, I don't know if you're also seeing things that way. As much as they say they are mourning, they're also looking at the political angle and thinking, okay, how can we break into the vote? How can we get some of the votes? So from time to time, we're going to be seeing people come up, hopefully, to inherit the votes, some sort of political inheritance. So how do you see this impacting on the political landscape in Nigeria? As a politician, you of course, you have looked at these things, done some permutation and all of that. Does this significantly impact what may happen in 2027 for you? Mr. Dio, if you can unmute so we can get your response.
First, let me start by saying that, particularly in northern Nigeria, Buhari was more than a leader, a political leader. He was a spiritual leader in that regard. And it so happens, I mean, there's not enough time. I tell you the story where that turning point happened sometime in 2002 when he was at the radio station in Kano and gave the infamous speech that earned him the name Megaskia, and the turning point began, and where he mobilized millions of passionate young northerners to his cause. But the truth is, he stood for something that, you know, the northerners at the time were yearning for, and he spoke truth to power. And that turned around his legacy and his following, because before 2002, former President Buhari lived a very quiet life after his appointment in PTF in Kaduna State. But between 2001 and 2002, that marked a turning point in the political landscape in northern Nigeria. And, you know, the political bigwigs at the time, people like Aminu Kano, people like Atiku Abubakar, you know, a few of them at the time were completely upstaged by the phenomenon that was President Buhari. And from then on, he commanded this 12 million loyal votes, you know, over the next decade or two, never seen before in Nigeria's political history. Now, but to your point about who inherits this loyal 12 million votes, that he courted over the years. The truth is, it's a difficult void to fill, because there were particular circumstances that led to him building that critical, loyal, almost cultish followership in the North. And those circumstances no longer exist today. And it will be difficult for any Northern politician today to inherit, those 12 million votes. But how that will play into the political permutations going to 2027, what you could argue are in two ways. Firstly, if President Buhari were still alive going into 2027, you would obviously see politicians court his endorsement. And wherever that endorsement swung to, you're likely to have decent votes follow. In that absence, there is no President Buhari to go and court or to go and lobby or to go and jostle to have access to that followership or that loyalty. So what you're going to see leading up to 2027 is people trying to inherit some sort of how do I put this now, to sort of speak on behalf of what President Buhari stood for and to see if they could tap into that amount of loyalty. But the truth is there's a vacuum in northern Nigeria. There's a vacuum of leadership. And the question lingering in the minds of many politicians is who will inherit that loyal followership that President Buhari has left behind. It's a difficult question to answer. There are people who were very close to him, particularly the CPC bloc, of the political arm of the APC. The question continues to remain, who inherits that bloc? And from where I sit, it's difficult for me to predict. It's extremely difficult to predict, where those numbers will go to. Maybe an El Rufai, who knows? But it's quite difficult to predict where those numbers will go to.
Difficult question, but perhaps not as difficult as, the conversation that we have had navigating through the contrasts of the legacies that the late general and former president left behind. But thank you, gentlemen, for making it quite easy and for your honesty as well. We've been talking with Mr. Samson Itodo, Executive Director, Yaga Africa. Thank you for coming through on this one. And we've also been talking with Mr. Ayodele Adiu, the candidate for the Youth Party in the just concluded local government election. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for coming through on this particular one.